All right, welcome back and Alive Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We're going to be joined by Politico's Melanie Mason in a moment here, but I do want to bring in Rich Rubino. He's our trusty political analyst who I always love talking about these big politics stories with. Rich, one of my favorite people to talk politics with. Great to see you, Rich.
Great to see you as well, Austin.
And happy debate day. I know these are...
This should be a national holiday, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of like the Super Bowl, but it's a vice presidential debate, so it's like something, I don't even know, a little bit below the Super Bowl, maybe like the semifinals, if you will. Let's get a live look at the spin room. The spin room's still active at this hour, Rich. We are, of course, talking about this vice presidential debate. The overarching thought about VP debates is that they aren't really that consequential, but is it possible that due to the fact that we've only seen one Harris-Trump debate, that this face-off carries a little more weight? I mean, Rich, this is the last time we may see the two tickets face off directly, correct?
Yes, I think to the extent that it matters at all, J.D. Vance was successful in not coming off as a threat in kind of the caricature that I think that Vice President Harris wanted him to come off as, the way that Tim Walz and in previous speeches has tried to make her out to be. I think to that extent, it was a win for J.D. Vance. The extent for Tim Walz, it was probably a win because it was at least a tie or a draw when they asked him the question of democracy and about restoring democracy, when he said that it was essentially that even if their campaign were to lose, they would shake hands, that type of thing. But at the end of the day, 2 days from now, people will be talking about something else. I really doubt that this moved the needle whatsoever. I can't think of any vice presidential debate that did move the needle. If you go back even to 1988, when Lloyd Bentsen was debating Dan Quayle, and he had that famous line, "Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. I served with Jack Kennedy, or no Jack Kennedy." The bottom line, people have thought about that for a couple of days. It was a loss for Dan Quayle, but at the end of the day, the Dukakis-Benson campaign landed up losing 40 states. So this is really going to have, I think, a de minimis effect. But I think that both candidates can basically declare, they're basically going to declare that they won. But it was basically probably a draw, with Vance probably doing a little bit better and not being seen as a threat.
All right, Rich, and I also do want to mention we want to welcome our friend Melanie Mason into the program as well. Melanie is a senior writer with Politico. We welcome you on the program, Melanie. Happy debate night. Thanks for joining us. I got to ask, maybe you would agree with me, and by the way, taking a live look at the spin room here, maybe you'd agree with me, Melanie, one of, if not the main goal of VP debates is simple. Don't make any gaffes, do no harm, don't bring any unwanted attention to your ticket. Were the candidates successfully mid tonight? Were they successfully mid? And of course, Walz did accidentally say he's friends with school shooters. There were some other little moments there. What's memorable about tonight?
Successfully mid is so great. I'm 100% going to be stealing that for my analysis. I think that is the perfect encapsulation of certainly what the goal was, and I think for the most part what they both achieved. I mean, I think that both of them were able to do what their job was to attack the other side's top of the ticket. I mean, you saw often that what Tim Walz wanted to do and what J.D. Vance wanted to do was that they weren't going after each other. In fact, they spent a lot of time talking about how much they agreed with each other, but then they would pivot to talk about the top of the ticket. And that's really what the role of the vice president is. It's to be that attack dog. It's to be the one that can land punches against these presidential candidates. I don't think that anybody had a major breakout moment in a fantastic way, but I also don't think anybody had a major breakout moment in an, oh my God, this is the end of your political career way. Hence successfully mid, which I think is a really apt description. I think that that's probably what people's takeaway is going to be. And I think to your point, are people going to be talking about this in 2 days? Probably not. And that is also, I think, the goal of a vice presidential debate is to fade into the background.
Let's start the hashtag on Twitter, guys. Successfully mid. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, so this was the first time both Walz and Vance participated in a debate of this magnitude. I'll start with you, Rich. Could you tell that this was their first time on a stage like this?
At the beginning, I thought that Tim Walz, he appeared nervous in the first question. I thought that perhaps that was going to be the way he was going to perform for the rest of the debate, but he really got his rhythm, and I think he really got it back. Remember, these are two people. These are not people. These are not political neophytes. I mean, Tim Walz was first elected to Congress in 2006, served for 12 years, governor twice, had many debates in the past. You can watch him going back to his 2000, just in 2022 when he was running for re-election. He had debates where he was actually more combative. JD Vance was actually relatively new to politics. He was just elected in 2022, and actually, if you go back to his debates against Tim Ryan in the general election, he was extremely combative in that election. Both of them, I think, had a strategy, and their strategy, they knew how close this election was, and they knew that they were thinking about Richard Nixon. They weren't necessarily thinking he said it, but that Richard Nixon said the first thing, his dictum was do no harm, and they knew that they were not supposed, that they did not want to do any harm. They knew if they made a direct attack on the other candidate, I think what the other candidate could come back with, they didn't necessarily know. So instead, they played it safe. They tried to be cordial with one another. You could see Tim Walz shaking his head many times in agreement with Senator Vance. And then they tried to go after the person at the top of the ticket. And at the end of the day, those tens of thousands of voters in 7 showdown states are not voting for vice president. Although if they see somebody as a vice presidential candidate that they see as a threat, that might be perhaps the last. That might be perhaps the last kind of chance they had. The last chance they had to vote for. That might be the last thing they decide when they. That might be the last thing they decide when they vote for the other candidate for when they vote for one candidate for president. But the bottom line is they know that this is going to be essentially vice presidents are really kind of irrelevant. Nelson Rockefeller, used to say that we go to funerals, we go to earthquakes. So I think that they knew this, and I think that they really kind of played. They kind of played taking on the presidential candidate rather than taking on their vice presidential debating counterpart.
Melanie, would you agree that it take a little bit of time for Walz to warm up?
Absolutely. He sounded jittery at first. And I do think that JD Vance he has a really smooth presentation. And I also think that he does a ton of interviews. And you saw it. And it has actually really struck me in the lead up to this debate. Tim Walz really struck me when he first got the vice presidential nomination as somebody who was very adept at media. I mean, obviously, it was his sort of viral moment of saying these guys are weird that I think really catapulted him to the top of the list. But he hasn't been doing that many interviews since he has gotten to that ticket, and I think that lack of practice really showed. And I think that on the other side, the fact that Vance is out talking all the time. I think sometimes in ways that can be held against him, when he's on these podcasts all the time, and then there are sound bites that come back to bite him. It leads to a 90-minute presentation that's very smooth, that's very comfortable. And so I think that you saw that, and also a way that JD Vance was going into this with historically low negatives for a vice presidential candidate. And so I think that what he needed to do, in addition to going after Kamala Harris, but he also needed to show people, I'm not as scary as you may think I am. You might have heard about the childless cat ladies or what have you, but I'm just a normal person who can sort of not come across as threatening. And so I think the fact that he had a pretty smooth delivery. We'll see. I think it'll take a little bit of time to see where the flash polls are and how people received it. But for pundits like us who are watching it, to me, it made me think, okay, he is understanding that this was a vulnerability for him personally, were his low personal favorabilities. And it seemed like he really was trying to counteract that picture.
Rich, did Vance seem to play a little more to the center tonight? Did he make an effort to explain Trump's policies and position with a little more of a gentle touch?
Oh, absolutely. JD Vance is somebody who has a very much an ideologically conservative history. And some of the statements that he has made about abortion being murder, for example, he very much tried to tamper that down. Donald Trump has tried to do the same thing in many respects. You could see in some points he would talk about, for example, how he supported abortion, how he did not necessarily think it should be decided by the federal government, or it should be decided by the states. He really was trying to do that, and I actually think he was efficacious in terms of coming off as somebody who was a moderate. Now, Tim Walz, when he was originally chosen back in Pennsylvania as the vice presidential running mate of Kamala Harris, he got up there and he basically said, this guy is weird. He really tried to take him on, and they were trying to make this caricature of him as this three-dimensional cartoon and somebody who was, who was extremely conservative. I thought that if I were him, I would have tried to compare him to somebody else who's perhaps unpopular in the country, a conservative Republican like Ted Cruz, for example. But Tim Walz also tried to do that. And Tim Walz, for example, talking about the fact that the fact that he was a football coach, he used to go pheasant hunting. He's also somebody that the Republicans have tried to make out to be almost like a San Francisco liberal type. And he really kind of counteracted that, I think. I think both candidates basically tried to play to the center, meaning that they both, what that tells me is that they both think that their base is locked up and that they're going to maximize voter turnout in Tim Walz's case in the left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party in the case of J.D. Vance. And an interesting thing, I was thinking going back to, say, 2005, 2006, when Dick Cheney was absolutely vilified by the Democratic Party, whoever would have thought that in both the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate, the major candidates would praise the endorsement of Dick Cheney. That just absolutely astounded. That absolutely astounded me. I kept thinking, imagine somebody doing that a Democrat starring the endorsement of Dick Cheney in 2008.
I want to ask a little bit about, there was discussion today about Walz and his history with China. I want to play this soundbite out, you two. Let's talk about it on the other side.
Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, well, and to the folks out there who didn't get at the top of this, look, I grew up in small rural Nebraska, town of 400, town that you rode your bike with your buddies till the streetlights come on, and I'm proud of that service. I joined the National Guard at 17, worked on family farms, and then I used the GI Bill to become a teacher, passionate about it, a young teacher. My first year out, I got the opportunity in the summer of '89 to travel to China. 35 years ago, be able to do that. I came back home and then started a program to take young people there. We would take basketball teams, we would take baseball teams, we would take dancers, and we would go back and forth to China. The issue for that was to try and learn. Now look, my community knows who I am. They saw where I was at. Look, I will be the first to tell you, I have poured my heart into my community. I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect. And I'm a knucklehead at times, but it's always been about that. Those same people elected me to Congress for 12 years. And in Congress, I was one of the most bipartisan people, working on things like farm bills that we got done, working on veterans benefits. And then the people of Minnesota were able to elect me to governor twice. So look, my commitment has been from the beginning to make sure that I'm there for the people, to make sure that I get this right. I will say more than anything, many times I will talk a lot, I will get caught up in the rhetoric, but being there, the impact it made, the difference it made in my life, I learned a lot about China. I hear the critiques of this. I would make the case that Donald Trump should have come on one of those trips with us. I guarantee you he wouldn't be praising Xi Jinping about COVID, and I guarantee you he wouldn't start a trade war that he ends up losing. So this is about trying to understand the world. It's about trying to do the best you can for your community, and then it's putting yourself out there and letting your folks understand what it is. My commitment, whether it be through teaching, which I was good at, or whether it was being a good soldier or was being a good member of Congress, those are the things that I think are the values that people care about.
Okay, so I wanted to make sure I played that out. Melanie, just to rewind for the folks watching at home, newly unearthed reports contradict previous claims made by Walz about his travel to China, including a claim that the Democratic vice presidential nominee was in Hong Kong for a teaching position in 1989 during the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protests that ended in hundreds of protesters killed by the Chinese government. Walz has said that he misspoke, but his response during that exchange felt a little awkward at times. Did you pick up on that, Melanie? Is that the kind of stuff that sticks in people's psyches after they watch these things?
I was baffled by that response. How did he just not have something prepared for that? I mean, I think that this is kind of debate prep 101, that there had been sort of elements about his record or about ways that he had described his past experiences that were already getting some news coverage. Feels like that was just a really kind of obvious thing to prepare for. And instead we got this pretty word salady answer that I personally found very hard to follow, and I'm sure that most people at home also found it hard to follow as well. So I don't really understand why he didn't have an answer prepared for that. Now that being said, I think in terms of whiffing an answer, is this something that is on the minds of a lot of voters already about what were the exact dates that Tim Walz was in when he was teaching in Hong Kong in the 1980s? Probably not. And so I don't know if this is something that's going to have a lot of durability. But I was surprised by that because it spoke to me more broadly about what that debate prep must have looked like. And this seemed like it would have been a really obvious question just to have a really crisp answer prepared for. I think that people can be pretty forgiving with the idea of, hey, I said that I was on the ground at this particular time. It turns out that I was off by a couple of months, but the truth is this was such a searing moment that it was, burned into my brain forever. I think people would be like, okay, that probably tracks and move on. The fact that he had to sort of trip over himself over and over, and in fact, there was a pretty awkward follow-up when he was pressed on it, a long, awkward silence afterwards, just made me wonder, why don't you have an answer ready on that? It seems like that would have been the first thing to prepare for.
Yeah, I wish that clip had that little tail end snippet there, because it did. There was an awkward pause there toward the end of that line of questioning. I want to watch another clip out, Rich. I'll ask you about it on the other side.
Look, this is one where there's always something there. This is a very simple proposition. These are women's decisions to make about their health care decisions, and the physicians who know best when they need to do this. Trying to distort the way a law is written to try and make a point, that's not it at all.
What was I wrong about, Governor? Please tell me, what was I wrong about?
That is not the way the law is written. Look, I've given I've given this advice on a lot of things, that getting involved, getting engaged, that's been misread, and it was fact-checked at the last debate. But the point on this is there's a continuation of these guys to try and tell women or to get involved. I use this line on this, just mind your own business on this. Things worked best when Roe versus Wade was in place. When we do a restoration of Roe, that works best. That doesn't preclude us from increasing funding for children. It doesn't increase us from making sure that once that child's born, like in Minnesota, they get meals, they get early childhood education, they get health care. So the hiding behind we're going to do all these other things when you're not proposing them in your budget. Kamala Harris is proposing them. She's proposing all those things to make life easier for families.
I asked a specific question, Governor. You gave me a slogan as a response.
It's not the case. It's not true. That's not what the law says. So they fact-checked it with President Trump.
Gentlemen.
All right, so basically what I want to do here, we know Melanie has to take off in a little bit, so I want to throw this one at Melanie. The issues, this seemed like a pretty issue-focused debate considering some of the other ones we've seen in recent memory. How did the candidates do on the issues? In voters' eyes, the GOP tends to have an edge on issues like immigration and the economy, while the Democrats tend to have the edge on issues like abortion and health care. Did either candidate score any points on some of their weaker issues, Melanie, or did the situation feel a little benign this evening?
I think benign is probably right. I mean, look, I think that Walz was strongest on the abortion issue, which is something that Democrats tend to be stronger on. I mean, I do think that J.D. Vance is very comfortable talking about immigration. That's sort of the centerpiece. All roads lead back to immigration, and particularly illegal immigration. We saw that in a lot of his answers when you're talking about housing, for example. He was able to bring it back to illegal immigration. So clearly they were both in their comfort zones. I think that where the points were best scored was in Vance's case, really trying to ask a question that
All right, Melanie Mason, we're going to have to let you go for the evening. We do appreciate your time here tonight. Have a good rest of your night. Rich, we'll keep talking, all right?
Absolutely.
All right. Bye-bye, Melanie.
Bye.
Bye.
Rich, so
Yes.
this, and I got to ask you too, because there's a lot to unpack about today's debate. I asked you guys last debate. It's worth asking again. How many undecided voters are actually out there at this point? How many voters are sitting there, scratching their head, wondering which way they lean. Have you talked to any, Rich?
No, no, I haven't. They're very elusive. And you got to remember, if you're talking about swing voters, if a swing voter lives in, say, California or Montana or Utah or Idaho or Arkansas, or really the 40 states that are not in play in this election, their votes really don't matter because we know how those 40 states are going to go. So you have to really winnow it down to swing voters that live in Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, um, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, and maybe in that one congressional district in New Hampshire, in Nebraska, and the one congressional district in Maine. So you're really talking about literally probably less than 100,000 actual voters. So that means that the candidate's first job is really to bring out as many low propensity voters that support them as they possibly can. For Tim Walz, that means low propensity voters on the left. For JD Vance, that means low propensity voters on the right. But in this debate, their strategy did not seem to be to try to placate or propitiate the base. Rather, they tried to they were trying to work toward the center, which tells me that their internal polls show that there are a lot of that there are at least a small number of undecided voters, and they think that they can actually get to them. But the other thing you have to think about some of these undecided voters, it could be that they're just disaffected with the entire system. That's why they haven't chosen one of the candidates. They might be disaffected with both Donald Trump and Vice President Harris, which means they have two options. They can, number one, say they're disgusted and stay home, or number two, they could vote for a third party. And I think that specifically there, and you go to a state like Michigan and Wisconsin, in the primaries, when Joe Biden was running, there was a group of Arab Americans that did not vote for Joe Biden that were Democrats. They voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary in Michigan. And Bill Stein, who's a Green Party candidate, is really trying to go after that constituency, which tells me that in the case of the Kamala Harris campaign, not only do they have a problem trying to siphon undecided voters from the middle over to their side, but also they have to siphon some voters from the left wing of the Democratic Party, and they have to show that they're going to be even-handed in the Israel-Gaza conflict. And Jill Stein is doing very well right now if you look at the polls with the Arab American community in those two critical battleground states.
Yeah, Rich, what demographic blind spots do both campaigns have? What type of voters do they need to appeal to? And did either make any headway with those blind spots tonight?
I think that Tim Walz being chosen by Vice President Harris was an effort by Vice President Harris to try to pitch overtures to traditional Reagan Democrats, right? They used to be Democrats. They were all the way with LBJ in '64. They supported Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan brought them over to the Republican Party, first in 1980 with his overtures, and then in 1984, they stayed as Republicans for George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were able to bring them over. Tim Walz was really kind of their tribune, their representative, right? He was the Democratic candidate who could appeal to white working class voters. He's somebody who was first elected in a congressional district in Minnesota that had only had one representative in 100 years, somebody who was elected governor of Minnesota, someone who had been a football coach, a pheasant hunter, someone who really has kind of those rural roots. And I think he tried to appeal to that in this a little bit in the debate, but it's more in his speeches that he tries to appeal to it. So that's really a blind spot. The other blind spot that, as I was saying, was that with Vice President Harris, she does have a blind spot on the left wing, and she does have a blind spot on the Arab American community, which came on in droves for Joe Biden last time around, but many are disaffected by what they view as the United States' continued financial support of the Netanyahu and the Likud regime in Israel. So that's a problem for her. And on the other side, in terms of JD Vance, and Donald Trump, their biggest problem, I think, a lot of respects, is suburban, traditionally moderate Republican voters, folks in places like Marietta, Georgia. Newt Gingrich's old congressional district is now represented by a Democrat, for example, because they view the Republicans as these are more business-oriented type Republicans who view the Republicans as more culturally conservative. They don't really see they don't really see their own plight as being culturally conservative. on issues like trade. Donald Trump has been very populist. I think many voters, in particularly business-oriented voters, are more or less free traders, for example. So those are really, I think, the blind spots. And usually when you pick a vice presidential candidate, it's to try to appeal to those ideological blind spots. And in Donald Trump's case, I think that populism, I think that he was also, not only did he try to appeal to an ideological blind spot, but he also was trying to reinforce his notion that he's a populist, not a traditional kind of libertarian type Republican.
You know, was there anything that you wanted the candidates to talk about tonight? Was there anything you wanted the moderators to ask about that you didn't hear them talk about tonight?
Well, I was a little bit surprised on a couple of things. The first of all, and I'm sure that both candidates were extremely prepared for it, would have been Ukraine. I think that that's something that Tim Walz really could have challenged J.D. Vance, because when J.D. Vance was running for his Senate seat in 2022, both in the primary and in the general election, he basically said that he was agnostic on the Russia in Ukraine war, and that it wasn't an issue that was really a big deal to him. I would have, if I was Tim Walz, I would have tried to bring that against him. I would have tried to challenge the Donald Trump sometimes antagonistic relationship with NATO, for example. Certainly, I think North Korea would have been another example of an issue that he could have certainly taken on. And I think also, just in terms of foreign policy generally, I'd like to see what they would emphasize in terms of, are they interventionist or are they non-interventionist? In other words, what would it take, under what circumstances, for both the Republican and the Democrat, would it take for them to first of all, to at least send financial aid to a country, to an ally perhaps, but also what would their threshold question be in terms of when they would send ground troops into a foreign conflict?
You know, the ABC News moderators during the Trump-Harris debate caught some flack for only fact-checking Trump. How do we feel the moderators here, Norah O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, did tonight, Rich?
Relatively well, except toward the beginning. And you said J.D. Vance kind of fact-checking the fact-checkers. Yeah. And he basically said that to the effect of, we've agreed not to have fact checks. I think that was actually a very good moment for J.D. Vance. He was able to do it in a very kind of in a very moderate type of a voice, so that he's not necessarily alienating those in the center that would say, well, he's representing the right wing. But I think that was really the only moment I can think of where there was really a fact check.
I want to play another highlight out here, Rich. Let's play this out where they talk about the economy.
Thank you. And Kamala Harris and I do believe in the middle class, because that's where we come from. We both grew up in that. We understand. So those of you out there listening tonight, you're hearing a lot of stuff back and forth, and it's good. It's healthy. That's what this is supposed to happen. You should be listening. How's this going to impact me? The bold forward plan that Kamala Harris put out there is talking about this housing issue. The one thing is, there's 3 million new houses proposed under this plan, with down payment assistance on the front end to get you in a house. A house is much more than just an asset to be traded somewhere. It's foundational to where you're at. And then making sure that the things you buy every day, whether they be prescription drugs or other things, that there's fairness in that. Look, the $35 insulin is a good thing, but it costs $5 to make insulin. They were charging $800 before this law went into effect. As far as the housing goes, I've seen it in Minnesota. 12% more houses in Minneapolis, prices went down on rent 4%. It's working. And then making sure tax cuts go to the middle class. $6,000 child tax credit, we have one in Minnesota, reduces childhood poverty by 1/3. We save money in the long run, and we do the right thing for families. And then getting businesses off the ground. The law as it stands right now is $5,000 tax credit for small business, increasing that to $50,000. Now, this is a philosophical difference between us. Donald Trump made a promise, and I'll give you this. He kept it. He took folks to Mar-a-Lago. He said, you're rich as hell, I'm going to give you a tax cut. He gave the tax cuts that predominantly went to the top class. What happened there was an $8 trillion increase in the national debt, the largest ever. Now he's proposing a 20% consumption or sales tax on everything we bring in. Everyone agrees, including businesses, it would be destabilizing it, it would increase inflation and potentially lead to a recession. Look, this is simple for you. Where are we going? Kamala Harris has said to do the things she wants to do, we'll just ask the wealthiest to pay their fair share. When you do that, our system works best, more people are participating in it, and folks have the things that they need.
And I'll just kind of start by saying that anybody that's taken a political science course, Rich, knows that the economy is typically the first thing people are thinking about when they're heading to the polls in November. What has been the rhetoric coming from both sides here? I know there's been a lot of discussion that sometimes on the Vance side, too much is said, and sometimes on the Walz side, too little is said. What do you make of what we heard economics-wise earlier tonight?
I think that JD Vance and Donald Trump are trying to do what Bill Clinton tried to do in the Democratic Party in 1992. Bill Clinton and Al Gore, he chose someone to reinforce himself ideologically as a centrist. They tried to be new Democrats. They tried to say that we're not traditional liberal Democrats. We want to reform welfare, for example, and it got him elected and got him reelected. I think that the Trump Vance campaign, and it was really the Trump in 2016, he ran on this as well, is a lot, their economic platform is a lot more populist. It's not a traditional libertarian platform. This is not something that someone like Milton Friedman or Frederick Hayek or some of the libertarian thinkers and economists would say, this is my platform. This is something that is very much, I think, that their appeal to working class. When they talk about tariffs, for example, how will that affect the entire economy? Well, it couldn't result in retaliatory tariffs. But contrary-wise, I think what they're trying to say is that when you institute tariffs, it protects domestic manufacturing, and many of those are traditional blue-collar voters who have been traditional Democrats. So that's where I think they try to appeal. They're very much, you do not hear, for example, about them talking about right to work legislation, traditional Republican issues. The one thing where they do stand with, I think, traditional libertarian type Republicans is they do tend to favor tax cuts, and the tax cuts will obviously sometimes go to wealthy Americans, and that's where Tim Walz tried to take on his opponent. On the other side, I think that Tim Walz and Vice President Harris, they're sometimes nebulous about it. They talk about the opportunity economy. They talk about lowering housing prices. This is actually one of the few times where I've seen him actually cornered in terms of explaining what their housing plan actually is. On their commercials, they don't really necessarily say it. I mean, part of that, you only have 30 seconds, 45 seconds, or a minute to do so. But I think what they try to do is they try to say that we're going to rebuild the middle class. We're going to try to build the economy, not from the top down, but from the bottom and the middle, essentially up, that they're going to try to expand the middle class. Vice presidential candidate Tim Walz often talks about his record in Minnesota, and his record in Minnesota is about one thing he did, and I think it might be kind of his North Star, if you will, is that he signed a child tax credit, and he also tried to bring down, or he did bring down, the prices of school lunch, for example. So those are the types of things. In the case of Walz, in the case of Vice President Harris, it's about trying to essentially bring the middle to bring everyone into the middle class and bring the middle class up. How are you going to do that? I think that partly because they have not had as many national interviews. You haven't really heard them try to explain in in assiduous detail. And I think in the case of Trump and JD Vance, a lot of their platform is really a traditional kind of Democrat economic platform with an addendum of a tax decrease.
I gotta say, one of the things that I noticed, I'm sure you noticed it too, there was a stark juxtaposition between the vibes between Walz and Vance today versus what we saw versus Harris and Trump. I noticed at least a handful of times that Walz and Vance said that they agreed with each other on something.
Yeah.
At one point, Vance said that he'd help Walz whenever he wanted. Can you picture these two dudes grabbing a beer together, Rich? And how much of a juxtaposition is it between what we saw at the Harris-Trump debate?
Yes, I was wondering how much of that was a strategy because they really didn't want to do any harm. And right at the beginning, JD Vance kind of got recognized vice presidential nominee Tim Vance and kind of said, "Thank you for being here." That's traditionally what used to happen in these debates. They would sometimes shake hands. They would actually thank the moderators. They had crowds. They would say thank you. They would thank the colleges or whatever the institution was that sponsored the debate. We've just become so negative and so polarized and so ideologically bifurcated that you don't see that anymore. But these two really, I think the only precedent I can think of where debate was this cordial for vice president was probably 2004 2000 rather, when Joe Lieberman and Dick Cheney was, I guess you would call, the kitchen table debate, when they were sitting around, or I guess a dining room table, sitting around a table, and they were kind of joking, and they would kind of sometimes go after their opponent's plan, but it was never kind of personal. I think that was very similar to what was going on here. But my guess is that there was a strategy behind it. Now, that being said, if J.D. Vance really went after Tim Walz personally, went after him for something like his DUI or something like that, I'm sure they had a strategy where he would really attack back. And if Tim Walz went after J.D. Vance, for example, for comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler in the past, I'm sure that J.D. Vance would have had a very biting retort to that one.
One more highlight I want to play out before we go. It has to do with election integrity. Let's watch.
Well, look, Tim, first of all, it's really rich for Democratic leaders to say that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy when he peacefully gave over power on January the 20th, as we have done for 250 years in this country. We are going to shake hands after this debate and after this election. And of course, I hope that we win, and I think we're going to win. But if Tim Walz is the next vice president, he'll have my prayers, he'll have my best wishes, and he'll have my help whenever he wants it. But we have to remember that for years in this country, Democrats protested the results of elections. Hillary Clinton in 2016 said that Donald Trump had the election stolen by Vladimir Putin because the Russians bought like $500,000 worth of Facebook ads. This has been going on for a long time. And if we want to say that we need to respect the results of the election, I'm on board. But if we want to say, as Tim Walz is saying, that this is just a problem that Republicans have had, I don't buy that.
Governor.
January 6th was not Facebook ads. And I think a revisionist history on this. Look, I don't understand how we got to this point. But the issue was that happened. Donald Trump can do it. And all of us say there's no place for this. It has massive repercussions. This idea that there's censorship to stop people from threatening to kill someone, threatening to do something, that's not censorship. Censorship is book banning. We've seen that. We've seen that brought up. I just think for everyone tonight, and I'm going to thank Senator Vance. I think this is the conversation they want to hear. And I think there's a lot of agreement, but this is one that we are miles apart on. This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further. But you guys attack us for not believing in democracy. The most sacred right under the United States democracy is the First Amendment. You yourself have said there's no First Amendment right to misinformation. Kamala Harris wants to use the power of government and big tech to silence people from speaking their minds. That is a threat to democracy that will long outlive this present political moment. I would like Democrats and Republicans to both reject censorship. Let's persuade one another. Let's argue about ideas, and then let's come together afterwards.
You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the test. That's the Supreme Court test.
Tim, fire in a crowded theater. You guys wanted to kick people off of Facebook for saying that toddlers shouldn't wear masks.
Senator, the governor does have the floor.
Sorry.
All right, Rich, the election denial angle to this, is this something that the Republican Party as a whole has been trying to step back away from over the months? I know Trump himself hasn't backed off of that idea, but is his party?
Yes, I think so. And I think that many Republicans, when they're asked the question point blank, immediately they'll say something to the effect that there are many problems, but they'll say Joe Biden is our president by basically answering it in the present tense when they're asked a question about the past tense. And that's typical American politics. I think that J.D. Vance missed an opportunity there. For one thing, he could have immediately said when he was talking about Hillary Clinton 2016, usually what Republicans do is they follow that up by talking about Stacey Abrams and her race for Georgia governor back in 2018, and many Democrats say that Stacey Abrams actually won that election, and she did not concede that election. So that's what I probably would have brought up. But I think that the moderators to a certain degree, but I think really Tim Walz missed an opportunity earlier in that debate because J.D. Vance said something to the effect that the Democrats, that the Republicans, that the American people chose the Democrats in 2020. So I think that he kind of acknowledged it, even if kind of a Freudian slip or kind of at a subconscious level. But Donald Trump himself has suggested that they've actually lost the election by a hair. He later said that it was a form of sarcasm. But if you listen to him when he talks, it doesn't appear that he's saying it in sarcasm. But I think most Republicans were telling Donald Trump privately, we have to put this behind us. And every time you're asked the question, you have to say something to the effect of, because he said so many times that they won the election. They have to say that we're focusing on the future, and that was kind of the rote response, if you will, by Senator J.D. Vance.
Rich, as always, being very generous with your time on these busy political nights. We appreciate talking to you. I know it's not quite the Super Bowl of politics, but we'll call it the conference finals of politics. Good to see you, Rich. Have a good rest of your night.